What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and my good friend, Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. I have this beer. So I got like a variety pack of Bitburgers today.
Okay.
And you ever have Bitburger?
I have. I do quite like Bitburger. What flavor are you drinking?
So this is quite an odd flavor. It is called Bitburger Radler Naturtrub.
Oh, I love Radlers. It's like
The
a lemon or a lime kind of beer flavor, right?
It's lemon flavored.
It's like a shandy.
It's like a shandy, and I feel kind of weird about it. I
don't
look
like it?
behind, and it is 1.9% alcohol.
Oh, man, slow down, Henry. You don't want to get wasted.
That is way too much for me.
Yeah.
I can't be having that much alcohol while we're doing a podcast.
I just recently picked up a variety. I really dig variety packs, by the way. How many different versions, how many different flavors did you get?
I think there's only 3. There's this monstrosity, then there's the regular Bitburger, and then there's a black lager.
If you're into IPAs, I just picked up a box of, it was like a 12-pack or a 24-pack, something like that, of Victory IPAs, and it came like 4 or 5 different versions. And I liked them all except for the sour, but I don't really like sour beers anyway. So, yeah, my recommendation to you.
I'm a big fan of sour beers, the way they taste, but they give me incredible acid reflux, so I can't really drink them. But I love them. I used to love them. But all right, let's get into today's topic because we have a lot to talk about. We're recording on Wednesday, January 20th, a very slow political day. There's absolutely nothing going on. There really hasn't been anything going on politically for the past month or so.
I'm starting to get worried about it. I'm a little worried, actually. It's too quiet.
It is too quiet.
It's weird.
It is too quiet. Maybe we'll talk about some things at the end of this show, but right now there's nothing to talk about.
Nope. So we're just gonna keep talking about ancient history, I guess.
I guess we're gonna keep on talking about ancient history, and this episode is not going to conclude our overall commitment to bring these types of episodes out, but I think this is going to be the last episode in this string of episodes dedicated to history in the BCs, ancient history. I think we're going to be
before COVID.
Before
BC.
COVID, we're going to be doing some more episodes on more modern history and switching back and forth. We're not abandoning this idea because we really enjoy doing these shows, but we're going to switch up our time periods a little bit, or maybe not. Maybe we'll get inspiration from another idea on ancient history, and we'll continue in this field. Who knows?
We'll see where it goes.
The world is full. This podcast can be full of surprises sometimes. But what we're talking about today is Alexander the Great. The guy who is known as perhaps the greatest military commander of all time. The man who forged an empire stretching over 3 continents.
Yep.
From Greece to India to Egypt. And he did this in just 13 years.
Super fast.
So I'm a huge fan of Dan Carlin. And I'm a hardcore history fan. And there's one of his first episodes ever was called Alexander versus Hitler. And what he does is he makes the case that the people of his time that Alexander conquered, they probably viewed Alexander the same way we view Hitler today.
We're gonna have to talk about that because that's a big claim. I haven't actually listened to this episode, but knowing what I know now after doing the research, I can see where he's going. But we're gonna have to come back to that.
The point is not to exonerate or venerate Hitler in any ways. You know how Alexander the Great is venerated in a lot of ways in popular history. The point was to say it's a perspective thing. So the people that Alexander the Great slaughtered, because he slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, probably thought of him along the same lines as how we view a dictator, a genocidal maniac in the 20th century.
Right.
That's what he was getting at.
We're definitely going to need to take Alexander down a peg for sure, because I think most people think about and view Alexander the Great as almost this kind of you can't really touch him. He's like perfect. He's, a conqueror, the best, that there is, and like super skilled at war and all this other stuff. I think the reality of it probably tells a completely different story though. And that's, I guess, what the content of this episode will be about. Taking him down a peg.
Taking him down a peg, but not necessarily taking him down a peg. It's more so to do a little bit more of a deep dive and just maybe ask some questions about not only Alexander the Great as a person, as a military commander, but more so kind of his psychology, which is an impossible task that we're doing right here. So,
right.
We're speculating on a lot of
fan
things
fiction at this point,
and making assumptions based off ancient historians and kind of regurgitating claims from current modern historians. But I think this will be interesting. Despite his accomplishments, he was a mass murderer, and he was also a rage-filled, paranoid alcoholic who would exterminate entire populations. He would frequently engage in ethnic cleansing. In addition, he would not just murder political rivals, but would assassinate members of his family, his friends, really at the drop of the dime.
Just one too many Bitburgers, I guess, right?
One too many Bitburgers. So for the most part, in history, when I was growing up, I went to Catholic school, and I don't know if it had to do with the Catholic education, but I think there might be a tradition in kind of Judeo-Christian type educational curriculums to venerate him as somebody who, linked the world together and made it possible for Christianity to thrive. At least that's the way that we were taught it.
Right.
He's credited as linking the East and the West together, kind of like how Genghis Khan was credited of doing the same thing.
Right.
And what his atrocities are, they're justified as strategic decisions. Mm-hmm. And we're warned not to judge these ancient figures through the lens of morality in our modern times, which is fair enough because everyone was an asshole back then. Everyone was conquering and slaughtering and doing obscene things. And
exactly. Just listen to the last couple of episodes that we've done on ancient history, and you'll get a sense for that, for sure.
Exactly. Like every ancient conqueror was slaughtering innocent people, and all these guys were murdering their political rivals. All these guys were assholes by today's standards, and by their own standards at that time as well. For example, look at Julius Caesar. Caesar slaughtered so many people in Gaul and Germania that even Roman senators condemned his actions. Mm-hmm. Like when Caesar executed over 400,000 German tribesmen, and those are Caesar's numbers, so it was probably not 400,000 tribesmen, but he said he executed 400,000 German tribesmen in one of his campaigns. The Roman Senate was like, what the fuck are you doing, man? Like, that's an absolute, that's one of the worst atrocities that we've ever heard about.
Right.
Like, so even Rome, this Roman Senate condemned a lot of his war crimes. And according to Caesar, like the way that he justified it was that it was a strategic decision.
I mean, even in the modern period, we have plenty of examples of this. I mean, you could even point some fingers at the U.S. and all of the collateral damage that we've done as a result of the many wars on terrorism that we've done. But those were considered strategic decisions to bomb the shit out of a, wedding or some shit like that with a Predator missile. I get when people say that, we shouldn't, judge these ancient figures, through like our current, standards on morality. But if you really want to go there, we kind of can judge them because we can judge ourselves in the same way,
These people weren't different. They didn't have different DNA.
No.
If you put somebody in our society and you switch them with somebody from Macedonian society.
If you put John Bolton in like ancient Macedon, he would have done the same shit.
he would have done probably worse. So the purpose of this episode is not, I guess it is not to judge I guess we are going to do some judging, but
just a little bit.
I guess taking down some sacred cows. But I'm more interested in diving into the factors of what made these people so violent and what lessons we can ultimately learn.
For sure.
I think that you guys will get a lot out of this dive into Alexander's background, especially his mental instability and paranoia, and what appears to be PTSD and possibly even CTE, which were all exaggerated by his addiction to alcohol.
Right.
So the first thing to touch is that here's a theme that we were going over frequently over the past few weeks, and that's the problem with ancient sources. And now we just have to address it again. Of all the subjects in the study of ancient history, especially ancient military history, few topics have really been covered more than the conquest of Alexander the Great.
Right.
What makes this interesting is that there are only 5 basic ancient sources on Alexander, and only one which was written during Alexander's lifetime. So the sources that we're going to be using and we're going to be referring to are Diodorus Siculus, who was a Greek Sicilian from the 1st century BC, so about 200 years after Alexander. And then we have Quintus Curtius, a Roman who we don't really know where he lived, but we think he lived in the 1st century AD. Plutarch, who we've been using pretty much throughout the past 2 episodes, who was a Greek in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. And then Arian, another Greek who lived in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. So all the writers that we're going to be primarily using are going to be Greeks or Romans who lived about 200 years to 300 years after Alexander had already died.
Correct.
So there's a problem there already. They're not writing from, they're not
from firsthand account.
They aren't firsthand sources.
Right.
We do have one firsthand source, and that source is Nearchus, one of his childhood friends and an officer in his army. That's where we're getting our primary source, and the most reliable source actually that historians will often consider is Arian. The reason why they say he is the most reliable source is because he's on CNN. Oh,
burn!
Because apparently he drew upon accounts from Alexander's senior staff. So these guys had access to stuff that we don't have access today, and they were using different sources. So that's the claim.
But even still, it's still secondhand accounts, right? So he's just referring to a senior staff, accounts by this senior staff. So it's never really like right then and there. So it's tricky.
Exactly, but you got to do what you can, and you got to see who matches who and who is summarizing the other historian, and
or just straight up pick the funnest story. I have one of those.
Pick the story that has the best movie appeal.
Right.
And this is how the main point is when we look at ancient history, we're left with the historian's own interpretation of these sources, and these historians depend on the same sources as other historians. And this is how you get at least 5,000 different books on Alexander the Great.
Right.
One of the primary books that I used and I've read for this is a really controversial book, actually, called The Madness of Alexander the Great and the Myth of Military Genius, by a military writer. I believe he's an ex-doctor in the Army and now an ancient military historian named Richard Gabriel. And I read actually 3 of his books in preparation for the show, along with some other books on Alexander the Great as well, and some ancient and the ancient sources. So I'm going to be repeating a lot of the talking points out of this book, just because I found I don't even necessarily agree with all of them, or can prove them right or wrong. I just found the book really interesting. So I'll leave the book in the show notes. But I guess to start this off, to really understand who Alexander the Great was, we need to go back and we need to understand where he came from. Mm-hmm. And where he came from was a kingdom called Macedonia or Macedonia. You can call it either or. I call them interchangeably. So I'll sometimes refer to it Macedonia, and sometimes I'll call it Macedonia. I don't know why. I think the rule is that you're supposed to be consistent, but I am not consistent.
It's pronounced GIF.
And many times I will pronounce names incorrectly in two different ways, inconsistently.
Yeah.
But Macedonia, which most people call it, is northeast of the Greek peninsula. Interesting enough, the name Macedonia has been the name of that region basically forever. It's been referred to in the Old Testament. It's been referred in ancient sources for thousands of years, which is really quite incredible because there's not a single other nation state that you can claim has the same name as
For all that time.
for all that time. Mm-hmm. Like France wasn't called France 2,000 years ago. It was called Gaul.
Right, exactly.
Or whatever the hell they called it. That's what the Romans called it. Like they don't,
Right.
we don't even, I don't know what they called it themselves.
We don't know what the tribes people called it. If they even called it one thing in and of itself, it was probably just many things, many smaller things.
And then it was Francia, and then it was, it wasn't really France until much later on. Macedonia was divided between northern highlands, referred to as Upper Macedonia, and then coastal plains, referred to as Lower Macedonia. And this area was very abundant in natural resources. So it had rich farmland. It had great plains to raise animals. So their horses there were bigger and stronger. They had large deposits of precious metals. And they had access to a lot of trees and a lot of timber.
That's right.
So
they also had coastlines, lots of them, and they had the land bridge to Asia Minor. So, it was a good trade route as well.
And that land bridge, though, and this will kind of segue into the next point I wanted to make, that land bridge actually caused them a lot of issues during the Greco-Persian Wars, because when Persia invaded Greece, Macedonia was the first place that they conquered. Or they at least subjugated and turned into a vassal state.
Right.
Because of their location sandwiched between Greek city-states and the European continent, they were surrounded by hostile neighbors. And because of their natural resources, they became the target of frequent incursions. So when a country is located on a borderland or in a marshland or within an area that is just surrounded by a lot of unfriendly people who would like to fight, the people there tend to become very warlike.
Right. Think the Sumerians or the Akkadians from our previous episodes. Very similar situation.
Or think Germans.
Also a very good one, yeah.
You could think in a modern context, you can say Germans, that when a society doesn't have those natural geographic protectors, the people are forced to adopt a warlike society to protect themselves, because then they'll just be prey.
Especially if they're rich and rife with natural resources, because then everybody wants to come and take your shit.
Yeah, exactly. So, according to Herodotus, another ancient historian we have been referring to a lot, there were three different warring parties in the Peloponnesian Wars. And I love the way that he describes this. So you had the Peloponnesian city-states, so that's Athens and Thebes and Sparta, all those city-states that we know of.
Right.
And then we have Gaul, Illyrian barbarians, so pretty much anyone in Europe, in mainland Europe.
Northern Europe, yeah.
And then Macedonians, who he says are not city-states or barbarians. He says that there's something in between. So the people who settled there, they spoke a form of Greek, but they developed their own unique Macedonian dialect. By the time of Alexander, it was his own language. The Greeks considered Macedonia as basically the boonies.
Right, middle of nowhere.
It was the middle of nowhere, and it was inhabited by savages. It's funny because when I was in school, I was taught this history, or at least when I was in high school, I was taught this history as if Alexander was a Greek. But in fact, he wasn't Greek. His father was Macedonian, and his mother, Olympus, played by Angelina Jolie, was an Illyrian barbarian.
Right.
And Alexander slaughtered Greeks the same way he slaughtered Persians, Afghans, and Indians.
Right.
He didn't really care. So when historians say that Alexander brought Greek culture to Persia, I mean, I don't really think that's the case because, in fact, it was the opposite. Alexander himself, he adopted, the Persian dress code and their kind of culture inclinations rather than bring Greek culture to the East.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little complicated. You're definitely right about him dressing like a Persian, but Alexander did kind of bring Greek culture everywhere, but not on purpose, more like as a result of his system of like governing his empire. But we'll talk more about that later.
According to Richard Gabriel, because of Macedonia's geographic isolation, I'm quoting him, in many ways, the Macedonia of Alexander's day very much resembled the society of the Mycenaean age, a male-dominated warrior society that had long since died out in Greece proper. Alexander's world was a world of clan warriors, barons, where the Iliad was not just an ancient heroic tale, but reflected how men lived. If you froze the Iliad in time, centuries before the Persian Wars or the Peloponnesian Wars, and they were kind of like this manly, masculine culture who were in tune with the gods, and you had characters like Achilles and Hercules, and these were the type of gods that were worshipped. Macedonia at this time was a superstitious warrior culture. They still had things like witches and sorcerers. Alexander's mom, played by Angelina Jolie, was believed to have worshipped snakes. She was like a snake queen.
Yeah, that checks out.
I think Angelina Jolie in real life worships snakes.
That's what I'm saying. I think it totally checks out.
I wouldn't be surprised. For example, they didn't practice the reason-based medicine that came from Greek city-states at the time. They would have like spiritual priests do some sort of like wackadoo healing or animal sacrifice when someone was like battle fatigued or hurt and things like that. It actually led to a lot of unnecessary deaths in those armies.
Well, but they culled the weak that way, I guess.
Yeah. but they were heavy drinkers. The Greeks were actually disgusted by them because they would not dilute their wine. They would frequently get into bar fights or drinking fights. Alexander was reportedly or allegedly almost killed by his father in a bar fight. Philip II. We'll get more to him.
We'll talk about him, yeah.
And they had a warrior tradition, so they had things like boar hunts for young men. They would have all types of symbols that they would have to wear until they kill the boar or kill their first man in battle. Those sorts of things. And then they were also like very sexually provocative. So, they'd go out and hump a lot.
It sounds like they would get along really well with Robert Baratheon.
Drinking and boozing and whoring. The whore is pregnant.
Girls and cracked skulls.
My warhammer came down with the might of 10 men.
Yeah, totally.
That's what I imagine it. Despite this, though, as I said before, Macedonia was rich with natural resources and it had a large population. Despite this, prior to the 4th century BC, they were still not a military power. They were not a military power due to basically their backward social structures. Who's fucking texting me over and over again?
Maybe shut that off.
Sorry. Oopsie daisy. Sorry about that. So they had backward social structures, and they had problems within their military as well. So the main one being is that they were unbalanced. They were cavalry focused. They didn't really utilize their infantry well. Nobles neglected their military significance. It was very much a cavalry
bunch of crazy horse people.
Exactly.
Horse fighters.
And that's good in some cases, but they clearly were just kind of a
not very
one-trick
well
pony
organized,
type of thing.
One-trick pony, literally.
Not well organized.
Yeah.
In addition, they had a lot of internal division, so they had a lot of local dynasties from Upper Macedonia, for example, that would refuse to obey the authority of the Aegead the Macedonian monarchy. And the Aegean themselves would even fight amongst each other.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of internal division. There wasn't this unifying nation state yet. And then there was also the fact that they were surrounded from all sides. Right. So they were surrounded by the Thracians to the east. That's where Alexander's mom is from, Olympus, who were seen as even more they were actually seen as barbarians. And barbarian just means that someone who doesn't speak Greek or Latin. Just bar.
Right. That's how the story goes. Right. Mm-hmm.
That's how the story goes. So to the east, they had the Thracians. They had the Tribalian Gauls to the north, the Illyrian Gauls to the west, and then to the bottom, they had Greek city-states. Here's a quote from a historian named Basil Cholov. So the history of Macedonia until the rise of Philip II could be described as a random shift of periods of unity and periods of anarchy. When a king from a powerful Aegean dynasty succeeded to eliminate or overcome all his rivals and quell the power of dynasties in Upper Macedonia, the country experienced higher stability, progress, and increasing development. Then it had greater impact on neighboring and distant regions of Macedonia, the Macedonian coast, and the entire Macedonian peninsula. But when the powerful king would have died, often killed, many candidates fought for the throne and weakened the power of Macedonia, which in such situations was threatened and frequently ridded by external murderers.
Yeah, no, I think that cycle is what kept them down for so many hundreds of years, and why, a lot of the Greeks really didn't bat an eye at them for a very long time.
Exactly. So they were just kind of like this unstable, borderline nomadic type people who didn't have the ability to, form a successful, monopoly on their local violence. Mm-hmm. So that dynamic doesn't really change until Philip II, the great king of Macedonia and the father of Alexander. Philip was taken as a hostage by Thebes after a failed campaign by his older brother, Alexander II, who's not Alexander the Great, is Alexander III. At this time, Macedonia was a punching bag. So Thebes was a dominant city-state at that time, and may have had the best infantry in the world. They may have even been better than Sparta at that time. As a hostage in Thebes, Philip had the opportunity to learn a lot more about the phalanx and how to implement infantry into his cavalry-based military. When he goes back to Macedonia and becomes king after his brother dies, he implements the Greek phalanx and everything that he learned in Thebes into the Macedonian army with a bunch of other reforms. And a lot of historians consider Philip, one of the great kings and generals of all time. It's interesting because he was actually installed as a king during an emergency situation. So due to every single time, some king gets killed, usually there's an emergency to replace them, and who's going to be the heir, and, especially if it was unexpected, like, what are we going to do? So he was the brother, and the succession went to him. And it had to go to him because at that time, Macedonia was going through a really big crisis. Due to the transfer of power, all of the surrounding neighbors were ready to pounce on them because they saw them as unstable. And he immediately started training a professional military force and implementing a bunch of political reforms. He had to centralize power to himself because a lot of the local noblemen had a lot of power as well. He didn't want to rely on noblemen and aristocrats to call his army. So in addition to this, he also gave citizenship to the people they conquered. Therefore, they were able to raise larger armies and kind of pull different resources from different people. And Macedonia came to mean being anyone who lived within the territory of which the king exercised direct political control. And what this creates is, maybe the first prototype of a nation state in European history.
For sure.
Now we can do an entire podcast on Philip's military reform. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. As we've mentioned, the Macedonian infantry prior to Philip kind of sucked. They had good cavalry, but their infantry was very far behind Greek city-states. So he implements what he learned in Thebes as a hostage into his own units. So what he starts to bring is the phalanx formation. He starts fitting his army with better armor, and then they also start using that 4 to 6 meter long pike called a sarissa that has two sides that you can kind of jam into the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, really long and menacing.
Super useful. Yeah.
When
if it's used correctly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But most importantly, he creates this military school like West Point, resulting in them having a really good officer corps. And with these military reforms, with the addition of their superior cavalry, because now they have the cavalry with this revamped infantry and an officer corps and improved logistics and things like that, just an overall reform, Philip conquers all of Greece, with the exception of Sparta.
Yeah, and the whole story around that is super interesting. And then I kind of went down a rabbit hole on this one. He actually, Philip started conquering his neighbors right after he revamped that military, as you said, because now he's got all these like fun toys and things like that to play with. So he started with Thessaly, and then Thrace, and then Molosia, which were in his direct peripheries, and he added them to the Macedonian Empire. But he had a lot of trouble with Greece, mostly because Athens and Thebes still had like pretty big territories, and had a lot of control in the region. And if you remember, prior to this point, Macedonia kind of sucked militarily. So I think that probably was to both their benefit and their detriment, to the Macedonian benefit and detriment. And on the one hand, it was to their benefit because nobody would have expected them to come down and smash them. But on the other hand, I think it also made it harder for people to come towards the Macedonian fray, right? Like, why would people want to join up with the Macedonians? They're crazy, savage, barbarian people. But I think slowly started dismantling, that kind of Greek hegemony. But I think the thing about the Greeks, and we've talked about this a little bit in previous episodes, is that while they definitely fight amongst themselves a lot, they have a tendency of like getting together and fighting against external invasions, right? So like hitting them head on and just like straight up, trying to conquer them probably wasn't a great idea. So Philip used kind of an interesting tactic, which was to use the wealth that his empire was gaining to kind of establish almost like a league of allies. He called it like the Macedonian Party. And so he started like persuading...
The League of Corinth.
The League of Corinth, right. So he started persuading people, city-states, that is, Greek city-states, to join him with money, basically, and use those city-states to pressure the other city-states into submission. It was actually pretty unique, right? It was like a kind of divide and conquer with money. So you're right. It was called the League of Corinth. It was an alliance that included most of Greece, and Philip of Macedon was obviously their head, except Sparta. So Sparta, Philip, there's this like very interesting story that goes that Philip had sent some emissaries over to Sparta saying, and I'll quote here, "You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your cities." And the Spartans responded, "If." That was it. So it was pretty...
I heard that. I've read that too.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty badass. I think probably realistically at this point, Sparta was almost a shell of itself. It had its power had been greatly diminished, especially after the wars. And I think Philip just didn't feel like it. I don't necessarily think he didn't want to fight with them, but I just think he didn't feel like it. I think he thought it was more trouble than anything, and he already conquered most of Greece anyway, and he didn't particularly need Sparta, so like he just left them alone. But this is like where the word, the laconic phrase comes from. It's basically like a short or a terse statement. I actually think that this probably, was part of the reason why. Let me start over. I think that Sparta specifically didn't end up losing to Philip just because they were ballsy like that. They probably would have gotten spanked if Philip had decided, like, all right, cool, let's go down and smash them. Because at this point he had most of Greece under his belt and had a pretty large army and was much more, much more organized than Macedon used to be.
He was like, you ever see Team America, World Police?
Yeah, of course.
When the guy's like, he has balls. I like balls.
Exactly.
One of those situations.
Yeah, that's why I think Philip never went down to Sparta to take.
I appreciate your balls. You can keep your state, but probably out of respect for Sparta's history too. He's just like, I'll pay them respect. I don't need to dominate them. It's only a small chunk of land anyway.
Right. It wasn't that important.
It's not like they're going to have influence like anywhere outside of their state.
They're surrounded by the rest of the Macedonian Empire at that point. So, yeah, it didn't really matter.
Alexander would have burned that city alive and killed every single man, woman, and child.
Yeah, totally. He would have been like, if. All right, word.
What do you mean, if?
Yeah.
He probably would have just barged in there and just did some Assyrian Empire shit.
Yeah, definitely. But he got so at this point he gets assassinated. Philip, that is.
Yeah.
And this story was fucking interesting because there's a lot of different accounts of like what might have happened. I know that in some accounts it was like Alexander himself tried to kill him so that he can gain power or whatever. But I don't like that story, mostly because it's boring and too cliche. I like this story better. And again, keep in mind with ancient history, we don't really know, and a lot of these are like not firsthand accounts. So. In this case, I'll editorialize a little bit and I'll pick the one that sounds the most interesting. So if you were going to make a story like a movie or something like that, this would be the story that you would choose. So Philip gets assassinated. So he was actually in a love quarrel with his ex-boyfriend, Pausanias. Now, I want to warn you guys, this gets a little complicated because people have the same names. Diodorus, who we talked about, the historian there, he basically, put forth this story, but it was first mentioned by Aristotle. So according to Diodorus, there was this general called Attalus, and Attalus had blamed Pausanias of Orestis, so let's call him Pausanias O, for the death of his friend, who was also named Pausanias. So Pausanias O killed the other Pausanias according to the general Attalus. But Philip and Pausanias O were getting it in. And when Philip left Pausanias O, he ended up hooking up with the other Pausanias, who evidently was the lover of this general guy, Attalus, right? So it's like a weird fucking love triangle between all of them. And Pausanias O ends up getting jelly that Philip is hooking up with the other Pausanias, and he ends up like insulting the other Pausanias in public. And Macedonians, I think you mentioned this before, but they're like super like superstitious and like kind of toxic masculinity stuff. So in order to like get his honor back, Pausanias ends up like putting himself in harm's way in battle to protect the king, and he died as a result. So because of this, the general Attalus was super like upset, and he wanted to punish Pausanias O and get back at him. And the way he did it was he got him fucking drunk and raped him. at a party. And at this party was Philip II. And evidently, Philip didn't do shit about it. And as a consolation for getting raped, he promoted Posonius O to the rank of somatophylax. I don't know what rank that is, but apparently it was like an elevated title. And so it was supposed that Posonius O's motivation for killing Philip was to get back at Philip because he allowed him to be raped at a party. All because Philip was fucking around with the other Posonius. That's kind of a hard story to follow, but it's fucking juicy.
So a lot of dude rape.
Yep. It was and all of this was like affairs too, because all of them, I'm presuming, were married. So it was like a bunch of gay affairs, like undercover, and they were swapping Posoniuses. It was a very interesting story. And I happen to like it better than Alexander wanted the throne, so he had his father killed. That's fucking lame. That doesn't sound cool.
Well, I mean, that's a theory that Alexander murdered him. It's not proven. None of them are proven. Mm-hmm. There's a theory that his wife killed him for the sake of Alexander. There's a lot of different theories. Right. We don't really know who killed him.
No.
This is a guy who had no shortage of enemies.
Yeah.
So it literally could have been anyone who killed him. But then there comes Alexander. This is where he becomes the new king of Macedonia. And we don't really know that much about Alexander as a young man. One of the most famous books about him is called Fire from Heaven by Mary Renault. And this is what Oliver Stone's movie is based on. Mm-hmm. The issue with this book is that it's historical fiction, as in it's an historical fiction book. Like, it's not meant to be like a scholarly work. It's meant to be entertaining. Like, it's like The Last Kingdom if you guys watch it. Like,
right. It's like the graphic novel 300 by Frank Miller,
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So a lot of his childhood is grabbed from there. We do know that he served in his father's army as a cavalry officer. Philip is eventually assassinated, but the ascension to the throne was really complicated. When Philip was murdered, Alexander was one of the last three surviving sons, and in Macedonia, illegitimate sons had equal claims to the throne. Alexander's half-brothers were threats to his throne. So according to Justin, who is another Roman historian, where we don't know when and where he lived, really, we just know that a lot of his work was used in the Middle Ages. Once he had assumed the throne after Philip's murder, Alexander had his cousin, his half-brothers, his stepsisters, and the entire family is put to death. He ordered the execution of Philip's new wife and her young child, as well as her extended family, to include Attalus, her guardian and well-known general. And according to Richard Gabriel, this was murderous behavior indeed for a young man who had not shown any a propensity for violence at all during his young life, and perhaps had not even yet slain a man in battle. So one of the main themes of this book by Richard Gabriel that I had mentioned before was that Alexander was an outsider to the military. Instead of going to the royal page, he was tutored by Aristotle. And because of that, when he was finally given a command in the military, he felt a need to prove himself.
Right. I think we often forget that Alexander ended up inheriting a lot from his father, and that's kind of the reason why we pointed out, a lot of interesting facts about Philip II, because really Philip II laid the groundwork for, Alexander to succeed. Right. He left him with a super wealthy empire around the Aegean Sea, He gave him the combined military power of the Macedonian army and all of the allied Greek states. As you mentioned earlier, he also got a good education from one of the greatest minds of the time, that was Aristotle. And by all accounts, he was basically, born with the ancient equivalent of a silver spoon up his ass. And that's kind of a good basis, I think, to start, because, you start with this like leg up, and you start with this like big shoes to fill, big shadow to cast. And you're right. He didn't come up from the military. He came up in this kind of aristocracy almost, and he did feel that need to prove himself. And trust me, he had plenty of ego to go along with it.
So I think that's a good place to transition. He was. Now, we don't know if this is true. So in this book by Richard Gabriel, one of the claims that he makes is that there's no evidence of him going to the Royal Page School. The Royal Page School is the West Point of Macedonia. Mm-hmm. I don't know how sound that is, or if that's like a real convincing argument. I think he very well could have had some. Frankly, I have no idea and don't have an educated guess if he went to that school and was also tutored by Aristotle or how that works. So I don't want to make a comment on that, but it would make sense that he would at the very least feel under the shadow of Philip. Mm-hmm. Because Philip at that time, was the great conqueror. Like, mm-hmm. No one had conquered Greece yet except Philip, and he's kind of like the CEO of a company, like the guy who comes to America and he starts his company with nothing with $5 in his pocket, mm-hmm. and then he creates this massive corporation, and then his son inherits, and then he gives the business to his son, and then his son is forced to expand the company even further. It's kind of like that dynamic.
Right.
Alexander inherits this juggernaut army which is what's really important about this is that the officer corps too there is experienced, they're war hardened. They had just been fighting for years, so he inherits this experienced, powerful army that he's able to utilize for his future conquest. Mm-hmm. And the personality traits that he has really kind of make him a larger than life figure.
Right.
So the traits like reckless courage and a huge ego were kind of a part of his ethos.
Yeah, I mean, talking about huge ego, we were talking a little bit about how he would wear Persian clothes, but I mean, it goes even deeper than that. I think he basically inserted himself throughout his conquests into the mythologies and the religions of all of the people he conquered. For some examples, he went to the tomb of Achilles in Troy, which was like symbolic to the Greeks in one way or another. So they heralded him in that respect. In Jerusalem, in the Levant, he ended up basically quote unquote respecting their god. God, and he accepted a place in their prophecies, right? So he ends up in the Christian Bible. In Egypt, he took on the role of quote liberator from the Persians, I believe. Yeah, and expanded the freedom of the Egyptian peoples, and thus he named himself the son of the god Amun and the king of the universe. What else did he do? And so wearing Persian clothes was like this small thing. He would go around and basically accept all of the titles and all the honorariums and like exalt himself and insert himself into their mythology and in their religions, because the Greek culture wasn't enough for him. He had to be in everybody's culture. He had to be in everybody's mythology and in everybody's religion. That's just the way he rolled. That's how big his ego was.
Well, he thought he was a god,
right?
At one point, he thought he was the direct descendant of Hercules,
right? And apparently the son of Amun. So,
or was it the direct son of Hercules or the direct son of Achilles? Whatever.
Both. They
Both.
had
I think it was
they had
both.
like a baby together, right?
Oh
Somehow.
yeah.
Yeah, and then that made him.
I mean, Alexander the Great even makes his way to like Islamic culture as well.
Yep. Everywhere.
Like,
He literally put himself everywhere. Everywhere he went. He's as far out as like Pakistani culture and like in the Indus Valley, in the Indus subcontinent, like in India, in Indian culture. Like he goes everywhere, and he makes sure that when he gets there, that he does whatever it is that's going to make him look larger than life. Like whether whatever that might be. If it means he has to wear the clothes of your king, he's going to do that. If it means that he's going to go visit some sacred place and like pretend like he's a person of prophecy, he's going to do that too. That was his style.
so I have a passage or a quote from a psychiatrist. His name is Nasser Gaim. He's a academic psychiatrist at George Mason University, and he has a book called A First-Rate Madness. And in his book, he developed 11 personality types based on the lives of 11 world leaders. So according to Nasser, the personality that most resemble Alexander's is that of William Sherman, the famous American Civil War general. Both suffered from what are called biologically abnormal temperaments, meaning both had traits that were divergent from average behavior. Abnormal temperaments are to be distinguished from mental illness, in that there is no implication that the subject suffers from the presence of a mental disease, but only that the demonstrated personality traits are divergent from the norm. Temperament abnormalities resemble lesser expressions or milder versions of mental disease, but with that caveat that the abnormalities are present all the time, while mood episodes like manic phases and deep depressions are episodic. Neither Sherman nor Alexander were manic depressive, but both possessed abnormal temperaments with characteristics that were milder versions of manic depressive illness, bipolar disorder, but less severe. Individuals possessing this type of personality tend to be highly self-confident, possess high energy levels, need little sleep, are given to rapid speech and impulsive behaviors, including a tendency toward explosive anger, can be doggedly determined in their pursuit of a task, often avoiding contrary evidence and experience, and are strongly resilient in dealing with objections and hardship. Hyperthymic personalities are also creative thinkers in their ability to think and see things in broad terms, a trait psychologists call integrative complexity. They often make connections between seemingly disparate things, leading to divergent thinking that others find difficult to follow or comprehend. Integrative thinking, the tendency to link things together in different ways, is the basis of creativity, but can also lead the person to formulate grandiose plans that only make sense to him. Hyperthymic personalities are risk takers, often ignoring or not seeing the obstacles to their goals. Divergent and creative thinking can lead to paranoia, with the person suddenly believing himself surrounded by enemies and spies. Hyperthymic personalities tend towards heavy alcohol use and active libido, activities that soothe them. Hyperthymic personalities are not disconnected from reality the way the mentally ill often are, but have distorted view of what's happening when measured against average or normal comprehension of occurring events. All right, I'm going to take a deep breath, and then I'm going to ask you, who does that sound like?
I mean, at the expense of sounding like a typical liberal, it sounds like Trump. I mean, obviously not entirely, right? Like, he doesn't drink, and I can't speak to his active libido, but I can certainly say that a lot of these tendencies are super similar, right? The couple points that jump out at me are, rapid speech, impulsive behaviors, explosive anger, dogged determination in pursuit of tasks. The bit about avoiding contrary evidence and experience definitely comes to mind. Also, kind of ignoring or not seeing obstacles to their goals. constantly the paranoia, person believing that you're surrounded by enemies or spies, like all this kind of sounds super. And it also goes to say at the end, like you pointed out, that it's not necessarily that they are mentally ill. It's just that if you compare them against like the average or quote normal comprehension of how events occur, they just have a real fucking slanted way of looking at things that is just totally not normal. It's not average. Let's just put it that way.
I think that you don't have to have TDS to have Trump pop into your mind when you read that. Like, right. I thought when I was reading that, I was like, oh, that's Trump. I think that sounds exactly like how Trump acts, minus the drinking and
right.
I don't know, the libido things. I don't know how much he gets it, although he
does grab him by the pussy.
He does. So. he has had.
He's got children.
Wives.
Right.
But it sounds like, based off the sources, Alexander the Great was that type of guy.
Yeah. He was that guy.
You're saying that Alexander the Great, my hero, who I was named after, is after Trump? If Trump heard that,
make Macedonia great again.
I'm Alexander the Great. Look at these guys. They think I'm Alexander the Great. I was great. Yeah.
Make Macedonia great again.
I don't know. I thought that was really interesting when I read that. So the ancient historians, they offer perspectives on why Alexander behaved the way he did as well, and their explanations are a lot more simple. Plutarch tells us that Alexander was jealous and resentful of his father.
I don't like that
Daddy,
story.
I can't do it, Daddy. Daddy, I can't live up to your standards, Daddy.
No, I don't love that. I don't love that. I don't love that Oedipal complex nonsense. It's just tired.
I was just having daddy issues. His father was the great national king, and he wanted to surpass his achievements. And I think some historians went into the area of like, well, he was never home because he was always out campaigning. So he was always with his mom, and his mom was batshit crazy and kind of warped his mind.
She was a barbarian, right? Uh-huh.
Well, his mom certainly seems batshit crazy.
She was the snake witch, right?
She was a snake witch?
Yeah, didn't you say that
her
earlier?
Story alone, her story alone is fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Like, she's one of the most interesting women ever. She's very interesting. And a lot of the examples of his risk-taking behavior are very apparent. So, one example would be the fact that he didn't stop marching east until basically his troops threatened to have a mutiny. Because he was just going to keep on marching through India. And
he was going to go straight to Japan.
Going. And eventually his soldiers were like, we're not doing this anymore. Like, we want to go home. Like, this is
also
ridiculous.
They were super afraid of war elephants. So that was a thing.
Yeah, that war elephants, but also like malaria, shit like that, jungle diseases. Mm-hmm. No one wanted to keep on marching that way.
No, they were also on the road for like 12 years at that point or some shit like that. So
yeah. I mean, at one point, you're just kind of like, hey, man, like, I accumulated all this wealth fighting and looting for you, but, like, now I just want to go home and, like,
chill.
Farm. Chill.
Yeah.
Alexander would also fly headfirst into battle with really reckless abandonment. So there's all sorts of stories about him scaling walls and him leading cavalry charges and him just doing like things that generals normally don't do. Just putting himself in complete danger. So whatever you'd say about him, he wasn't a bitch.
Right. Or at least we're told that he's not a bitch.
What's that?
At least we were told that he was not a bitch.
At least we were told, but it seems that, I don't...
Every account of him seems like he wasn't.
Had kind of like that reckless courage.
Right.
Now, this actually brings me to an interesting point. So One of the injuries, he had a lot of injuries. He had over 7 really, really bad injuries throughout his campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
One of those injuries was a severe concussion that may have given him permanent brain damage.
Oh, yeah.
So during a battle in Afghanistan, he had a rock thrown at the back of his head. Very unclimactic. Just somebody just threw a rock at his fucking head. Kind of like Mardonius in the Battle of Plataea. A Spartan threw a rock at his head and killed him. So this was so bad, according to the historian Arrian, who's considered the most reliable, and many of the other historians write the same thing, that his troops thought he had died. So
he got knocked out real good.
We don't know where he was hit. It was most likely at the back of his head. And this is used to explain a lot of his really bizarre behavior in his later years. So, again, one of the writers I was reading a lot of was Richard Gabriel, and I kind of do trust him on this because he was a doctor in the Army, and his take is that rock in the back of his head probably caused him a very severe concussion that resulted in a traumatic brain injury.
Right.
That further prohibited, his mental capacity.
Literally knocked a screw loose.
Yeah, because he was like, the symptoms that he had were like being bedridden for like 3 months, like not being able to get up, like quivering in his tent. He had temporary blindness. I've had a concussion before. I had a pretty bad concussion too, and I was very sick for 2 days, like just nonstop puking and throwing up. But after that, I was fine after about a week or so. I started feeling like myself. Do you know Antonio? Do you know who Antonio Brown is?
I do actually. Yeah, he's he football player.
I know sports.
I know sports ball.
So Antonio Brown had a really bad
interesting
hit.
case. Yeah.
And after this hit, he went crazy.
He went nuts.
A lot of people like to trace this because Antonio Brown was a likable player in the NFL for years. He was seen as one of the better guys, like a higher character guy, someone who worked hard, who went to a Division I AA school, was a 5th round draft pick, who was able to make himself into the best wide receiver, in a generation. He has this really bad hit, in a helmet-to-helmet hit, and it looked terrible. It looks traumatic.
Sounded even worse.
And he wakes up, and over the next couple of years, he starts acting nuts, just like exhibiting behavior that he didn't exhibit before this head injury.
There was this one story where he threw a bunch of furniture out of his 14th floor window, and apparently he almost hit a kid on the patio below him.
He almost hit a kid.
Yeah, he was speeding, drinking. Apparently he did a whole lot of domestic abuse with his former trainer and with his girlfriends and things like that. He was accused of rape a bunch of times. Felony burglary of a vehicle, misdemeanor battery he pled guilty to. Criminal mischief he pled guilty to. This guy got into a whole lot of trouble after he got hit in the head, a lot.
And Aaron Hernandez, when they did the CAT scan on his brain, they found that he had the most CTE out of anyone they've ever, out of anyone's, or maybe it wasn't the most, but he was around 30 or so when he had died. And, they said it looked like the brain of someone who had been playing football for 50 years or so. He had very serious brain issues. Not to say that he murdered those people because of the brain issues, but...
it's context. Right.
From what I've seen as far as the science with head injuries when it comes to football or any sport where you're taking blows to the head, I think those consequences are very, very much real.
Yeah,
They're
no,
very real, and it's very possible to cause lasting brain damage.
Or
Playing
aberrant
football
behavior
or boxing.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
Or aberrant behavior in general, right? Like even
Or
if you don't go way off the deep end and like kill people, you might end up having like these bouts of like uncontrollable anger or like, you know, just mood swings generally speaking, right? So even like the light side effects for it can affect you greatly. And if we're pulling it back to Alexander the Great here, if he gets, you know, smacked by a rock in the back of his head and he ends up bedridden for, you know, by some accounts for 3 months, as you said, you can imagine that probably caused a pretty strong brain injury. And if all of these historians are saying like after he got hit with the rock, he started acting really fucking weird, you know, those things kind of line up, right? Like obviously we're doing like some, you know, some forensics that can't be done because we don't have firsthand accounts or like CTE scans for Alexander the Great's brain, but you can make some guesses and it sounds about right.
Well, in the case of the football, that's like, you know, that's long-term abuse. This is one blow to the head.
Right.
So I don't really know what the difference is as far as like the long-term effects for, you know, one versus the other. But it's kind of a different thing from what like most football players are getting CTE from.
Mm-hmm.
But I think because this is completely bro science for me. You know,
Right,
it's bro science for everyone when they say that Antonio Brown got hit stupid.
Right.
But it certainly seems fucking
it's possible.
Likely, like just based off his behavior before and after the hit.
Yeah. There's this one story
think,
of like this guy that worked on a railroad a long time ago. I forget his name, but he was like laying some dynamite and then, you know, went to go put in a rod and the dynamite exploded and the rod shot through his face, through his skull, went out the back of his skull and like flew out and like, you know, they found it like fucking super far away later, but he lived, right? And this was back like in the old West.
How the hell did he live?
I fucking do not know. But he lived so much so that he like walked to the hospital or some shit like that. Forget the exact, I'll Google it later, but the story was nuts. But the point though is that after he got this brain injury, because there's no question he got a brain injury, the fucking rod went through his head, right? After that, apparently he developed like what we would call, you know, Tourette's syndrome. Like dude was like curse up a storm and like twitch and shit like that and like just be generally like erratic, aberrant behavior. So if you have a traumatic brain injury, even just the one, if it's bad enough, I think there are plenty of cases to point to the fact that even if it's just the one and not like a sustained like years worth of football brain injuries as an example, I think there's also a case to be made there as well. But again, bro science, right? Like we're just guessing.
Bro, there's always some good bro science and bro history. Yeah, we're totally speculating, and you know, Robert Gabriel's speculating as well. But I think it's interesting to think about at the very least, to throw that into the equation. Now, you have to, when examining Alexander, though, you have to kind of go over the actual massacres he did, and honestly, it's really hard to because there's too many to count because he was campaigning for so many years. But I'll just go over some quick ones that he's known for, and I probably won't even get to the really big ones either. But here are some of the earlier ones. So one of the first things that he did was he burned Thebes to the ground. So Thebes was one of the great city-states. When Philip II conquered Greece, he created the League of Corinth, and Thebes left after he died. And as payback, Alexander went and he, according to Diodorus, as a slaughter mounted in every corner of the city was piled high with corpses, no one could have failed to pity the plight of the unfortunate. More than 6,000 Thebans were killed and 30,000 more sold into slavery. So that was an ancient source, but It seems like he did burn the city to the ground, most likely as a message to other Greek city-states. There was a battle of Granicus. So, according to Plutarch, when Alexander landed in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, 18,000 Greek mercenaries tried to surrender to him and join his army. And instead, Alexander slaughtered every single one of them.
So this is where he's going from Robert Baratheon to just straight up Daenerys Targaryen, right?
Yeah,
and just straight up burning them all,
Exactly. Plutarch says that this was out of passion rather than judgment when explaining the killing. According to Quintus Curtius, he killed the civilian population of Gaza, so at least 10,000 people, and then he tortured the Persian governor, and he enjoyed it. And it's actually interesting, the story about him torturing the Persian governor. He brought this guy out, and he was like, you better obey me. I'm Alexander the Great. I'm the best. And the guy just looked at him and didn't say anything. And he's like, you don't answer me. And then he tortured him with the chariot. He dragged him along a chariot like Achilles did to Hector after he killed Paris. Or not killing Paris. What's his boy's name? Patrice.
I forget.
Fuck,
Achilles' boy.
My name. Achilles' boy, who he. Whatever. It's not important.
Patroclus.
Patroclus. Let's call him Patrice. Probably one of the worst things that he did was he burned down Persepolis, which was the capital of Persia. And in doing this, he did it in a drunk orgy. There's the story is that they were just hanging out. Him and his friends were drinking in camp, and they got drunk, and they're like, let's just burn this fucker down.
It's fucked up. It's nuts.
And the tragedy of it is that they destroyed so much history in that. There was so many important things that they destroyed by burning down that city. Mm-hmm. Think about all the sources that we don't get from the Greco-Persian wars from the Persian side because they burnt down the capital.
Right.
There was no reason to do that.
No.
And it just goes on and on, the stories about them going and eradicating tribes and just ethnically cleansing tribes and different peoples as they're marching eastward. It's pretty bad and pretty fucked up. And you have to ask, when and where does PTSD come in? Do these do these Macedonian soldiers, or do soldiers in the ancient world in general, are they experiencing the same type of combat fatigue as what's recorded in modern history since World War I? Because the Greeks were aware of mental illness caused by the trauma of war, and where and they were the first to practice, a sophisticated form of psychiatry. Greek literature is actually filled with accounts of soldiers driven mad by war. Just look at the Iliad and the Odyssey. Mm-hmm. There's so many accounts of soldiers being driven mad. Achilles literally goes into a berserker mode at one point, and the whole book is about how he goes kind of crazy. When you think about the Iliad, Achilles. Why am I saying his name so shitty? Achilles is slowly going mad throughout the entire war, and it ends with him kind of just doing this barbaric act against humanity, desecrating the body of Hector. And then in the Odyssey, he's in hell. Because Odysseus finds him in Hades, and he's miserable, and he's like, I would spend one day as a like to get out of here, I would, live my life as a farmer. I forget exactly what he says, but he's miserable in Hades.
Mm-hmm. It's a really drab place.
Yeah. So Herodotus actually recorded the symptoms of the first clinical case of a psychiatric collapse in battle. So he tells us that soldiers along the battle line steadied themselves for the attack. All up and down the line, men shook with fear, vomited, and lost control of their bladders and bowels. And this is the Battle of Marathon he's talking about. So even the Greek writers at the time were taking account of, people, soldiers, and almost a panic before the fight. And whether in ancient or modern times, exposure to the stress of war most likely seriously impacted one's sanity and ability to function in a normal society. And it's unlikely to expect that Alexander's 13-year exposure to violence and slaughter might have seriously impacted his mental health. Right. Because the battlefield at this time, like a ancient battlefield, has a lot of sensory stressors everywhere. So there's mutilated bodies, there's soldiers screaming in pain, there's your loss of your friends, there's rotting flesh. I would imagine it's a really awful, kind of brutal place to be.
Yep.
And it may be likely that the rate of psychiatric casualties were even higher in ancient conflicts, because all the killing that took place on these battlefields were at a close range.
Right.
So a prolonged exposure to combat in this military environment may have really just kind of deranged Alexander, throughout the campaign, and progressively made him more violent and more paranoid, because towards the end of his life, he was killing his friends like left and right, killing people for like small slights. The best part of this book by Richard Gabriel is his book where he proposes the theory that Alexander was suffering from raging PTSD. So I actually have part of this pulled up, and I just want to share this with you and see what you think.
All right, I'll take a stab at it. A soldier's prolonged exposure to war can create an almost constant sense and expectation of betrayal by those around him, destroying any capacity for trust and leading to the individual's psychological isolation. Research has shown that soldiers in this condition are 7 times more likely to suffer a major depression and 11 times more likely to suffer a dysthymic disorder, a fluctuating state of depression. Alexander nursed a sense of betrayal that developed into a deep paranoia. As his wars went on, he began to see enemies everywhere, even among his closest friends and comrades. In every case, Alexander dealt with his fear by having the conspirators killed. A battle-hardened soldier either quickly acquires a set of survival skills or he dies. The soldier's hyper-vigilance is accompanied by the need to react quickly and with violence. Soon, the soldier may lose the ability to respond to simple disagreements or other social situations in any other way, leading to the activation of combat survival skills in other than combat situations. This explains why a simple misunderstanding can often lead to a violent physical attack, say, in a bar, when a combat veteran perceives himself insulted or being stared at. Alexander, like many veterans, seems to have forgotten how to deal with even the most minor difficulty with anything but violence. In India, he hanged a group of Indian philosophers who had the temerity to disagree with him, and had the defeated Persian commander at Gaza dragged around the city behind a chariot because the man remained silent when Alexander threatened him. Achilles' first reaction to Agamemnon's order to turn over the slave girl was to reach for his sword and kill his commander. Alcoholism and drug use are common symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and both are employed by the soldier as a way to numb the psychic pain that afflicts him and reduce the effects of his other symptoms. There is no doubt by the end of his life, Alexander was surely a heavy drinker and perhaps even an alcoholic in the clinical sense. His increased drinking coincided with the clear emergence of other symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and character disorder. Post-traumatic stress can lead to suicide. Two of the most common triggers of suicide in veterans are guilt and despair. Watching one's comrades die in a situation where you have to survive, or having ordered soldiers to do something that cost them their lives, often produces survivor's guilt, a sense that it was my fault, or it should have been me that died. One set of permanent psychiatric reactions to prolonged war stress are called character disorders. The terms are somewhat misleading in that they seem to imply that soldiers' characters have been disordered by conscious action. This is not the case, however. Correctly understood, character disorder is a condition in which prolonged stress of war creates problems so deeply seated that they become part of the soldier's personality. Character disorders include stable obsessional states in which the soldier becomes fixated on certain actions or things. Paranoia accompanied by irascibility, anxiety, and depression, often accompanied by the belief that the soldier is surrounded by enemies who threaten his safety. Schizoid trends leading to hypersensitivity and isolation. Epileptoid character reactions in which the soldier becomes irritable, stubborn, egocentric, and aggressive, accompanied by periodic rages. The development of extreme dramatic religiosity, and, ultimately, the degeneration into a psychopathic personality. Character disorders represent a fundamental altering of the soldier's personality that is extremely difficult to reverse. All too commonly, the symptoms accompany the soldier for the rest of his life.
So, I found that very interesting to apply that to ancient figures. Because not only could you apply that to just Alexander the Great, you could also apply that to a lot of the other brutal warlords of our time. Or, the warlords who are on the battlefield, like maybe Genghis Khan or Julius Caesar, Sargon of Akkad,
Mm-hmm.
or Sargon II of the Assyrian Empire. Maybe you could apply that. You have to think that getting up in somebody's face and stabbing them or poking them with something sharp and seeing them dying and seeing your friends die the exact same way that's got to have a profound impact on your psyche. And because, again, these people aren't that different from us. Like, they had the same fears in battle.
Right, they're still human.
After 13 years of intense war campaigning, I think it's probably likely that he experienced some form of PTSD that degraded his personality. So, I guess covering this, we hit kind of three things that may have impacted Alexander the Great's mental health. His possible PTSD, his personality disorder, along with his brain injury that he suffered. There may have been a lot more. We didn't even get into his addiction to alcohol,
right?
Which I'm sure certainly didn't help him.
Raging drunk, right?
His raging alcoholism. But do you want to talk about, I guess, maybe to end this up and talk about just like Hellenization and just, some of the consequences of...
Yeah, for sure. And this is just calling back to something we spoke about early on in the show here. But, Alexander, he did more than just like conquer and destroy things. He also built things. But I wouldn't exactly say that he built them like on purpose. You got to remember that the area that Alexander the Great conquered was something like 2 million square miles, right? And it spanned across a lot of different cultures, a lot of different religions, even just a lot of different languages, right? So language being one of the more important ones, Greek as an example, and specifically his flavor of Greek, the Macedonian dialect, went from being a language that was spoken in basically a tiny little corner of the world into the official language of an entire empire that stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Himalayas, right? So it's not an easy feat. And in order to kind of do that and unify all of these disparate cultures into a single civilization, Alexander definitely imposed a type of Greek style city-state, template across the entire empire. But I think Hellenization, which refers to the adoption of Greek culture across this region during the time of Alexander, I think that kind of happened as an offshoot. Like, it wasn't intentional. As an example, he would set up a city, right, that was like a Greek style city, where Persepolis was previously, as an example, right? And then he would appoint some random Greek guy to lead that administrative center, and perhaps out of fear for Alexander the Great, or out of reverence, because remember, he also liked to insert himself into their culture and into their religions and make himself an exalted figure. But a lot of the times these conquered peoples, when they would set up these Greek style city in their neighborhood, they would try to make their Greek administrator feel at home, and each of them would try to push the limit on how much more Greek can we be, right? How many more columns can we put on this fucking building? And many of them adopted Greek as their language as a result. But I don't think that was necessarily like an intention of Alexander the Great. I think it was like kind of an end result of all of the things that he did, right? Either when he was either brutal with these people, so they were fucking fearful of him, or his giant ego created this like era of him. Like, especially if we think about the Egyptian city Alexandria, which was obviously named after Alexander, they thought of him as a liberator, right? It wasn't like, oh shit, this is this guy's a fucking nut job, let's make him happy. They really liked him, right? Like, they very, very much liked him, so they wanted to just be as Greek as possible, just to like curry favor from him. And what's kind of unfortunate is that Alexander never got to enjoy the fruits of his labor, because he was on this campaign for the entirety of his rulership, and as you point out, he died along the way, and he ended up dying in Babylon. We're not really sure exactly where or exactly how, to be honest. There's a lot of different opinions of poison, sickness, or just straight up he was tired, exhaustion there. But
there's a rumor, there's a conspiracy theory that Aristotle poisoned him. Really?
I didn't hear that one. That's interesting.
That's one of the more kind of far out there ones. But
I could see it, because towards the end of his day, he probably made a lot of fucking enemies, like we pointed out earlier. And what's interesting about this is that he didn't exactly have like an heir to give everyone to, and in true, like, it was totally on brand for him at the time. Instead of naming a successor, he was just like, the empire goes to the strongest. That's all he said. And so, like, way to set up your kingdom, your empire that you just spent 13 years building. Way to just like take a match and just burn that shit down. Because like what resulted from that is like literally everyone fighting to take control of this massive fucking empire, right? And like his last batshit crazy thing that he decided to do was make everybody fight for his empire. Like that's how fucking crazy this guy was, like to the bitter end. But it was totally on brand. It was totally on brand for him,
And dude, the funeral wars, or no, the funeral games is what they call it. So when they divvied up Alexander's empire, because all of his generals were superstars too.
Right.
Like
exactly.
he had awesome generals. So you have all of them scrambling to like carve up pieces of this empire, and you have like these really weird like at some point Ptolemy, his childhood friends, who establishes
the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt,
Ptolemaic
right?
kingdom in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and Cleopatra is the Cleopatra the seventh that we know that we think of, who got involved with Caesar and Mark Antony. She's a direct descendant of him.
Evidently,
he ends up like stealing the body from another general. I forget, like one general has the body. They end up stealing the body because the rightful heir would be the one who performs the funeral.
Keep the body,
like,
right?
There's just all sorts of like crazy shit happens. But I think if you wanted to make $1 million TV show, like a new Game of Thrones, I think you make a TV show about like the first season, first couple episodes, Alexander the Great dies. He dies, and then it's about like the split up of the empire, and like everyone backstabbing each other and trying to get a piece of it. Like,
so, like the four empires: the kingdom of Macedon, the kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor. We talked about the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, and then the Seleucid Empire in the Far East. So, like the four of them warring against each other. This would be like your $1 million pitch to Netflix.
I think that would be the new Game of Thrones. You could even name it Funeral Games.
Yeah, right.
That would be so interesting, because then you could have also strong. There's a bunch of strong female characters you could have, because his mom was still in the picture,
right?
Like, so you'd have that kind of diversity to,
you'd have Cleopatra coming at you.
You'd have a lot of very interesting characters. I think it would make for a really good television show. I think it would be a lot better than making a show off like the Greco-Persian Wars or something like that.
Yeah, I'd watch it.
I think that would be a great show if you were going to do something. And obviously you fictionalize it, like, you make it a good story. You sacrifice
really don't
historical
have to.
accuracy.
You really don't have to, because
you have to take liberties, though.
Yeah,
you have to take storytelling liberties. Another really good show that they could make based off an historical event is the fall of the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, but like the 25 years before, like the time of Julius Caesar, because there was the Roman civil wars before, like 50 years before Julius Caesar took power. That's really interesting politics as well that like went on. It's a bunch of backstabbing. But I mean, maybe an HBO producer is listening to this episode, and maybe we can pitch some TV ideas.
We've got plenty of ancient history ones. Yeah,
somebody emailed me. One of our listeners emailed me with some ideas about musicals. Remember when we talked about?
Oh yeah,
yeah. Send us an idea of a good musical.
Yeah. Let's do that again. Yeah,
we should do that again. Yeah, that was really funny. I don't have the email up in front of me right now, but I appreciate you reaching out. We had asked our listeners to send us ideas on what musical. I had just saw Hamilton, and I was like, what is the best historical topic that you can make a musical on? And I said that to do one on Richard Nixon and the Shah's relationship.
The Shah and I.
The Shah of Iran.
The Shah and I.
The Shah and I. All right, I think we are very much over. So, do you want to?
Let's just wrap it up, and if you want.
Do you want to talk about the inauguration and for our Patreon?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea.
Let's do that. So what we're gonna do is that we're gonna wrap up this episode. Thank you so much for listening to this hour and a half program on Alexander the Great. We really hope you learned a few things and found things interesting. Make sure to rate and review the podcast. That is number one way to help us grow. We recently hit over 400 reviews, which is really awesome. I remember when we were begging you guys to get 100 reviews. So we're at 400. Keep on rating and reviewing the podcast. It really helps us grow. And tell your friends about this show. Share this podcast, on your social media accounts. Spread the word. We built this show completely on word of mouth. 100% word of mouth. That's how we built this show. and that's how we're going to continue to grow. Tell people to listen to Bro History. And then if you want to support us, if you want to listen to more content, we will be putting a Patreon episode out. We're going to talk about the inauguration in a moment. So you can find us at Patreon at Bro History. You can support us for $1, $3, $5 a month, whatever you have. We appreciate the support. It really does mean a lot. So join us on Patreon. You also get access to our Slack account where our listeners and us, we talk and communicate and shoot the shit and just have fun on it. So join us there, and let's wrap this up and start talking inauguration.
Sounds good. Peace, everybody.
All right. Peace.